And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, Ben Kiel and Jesse Ragan. Ben is a typeface designer, an educator, and a partner in XYZ Type. Ben worked for several years at House Industries with a specialty in solving complex problems at the overlap of design and technology. He received his MA in typeface design from University of Reading. And he currently teaches at the Washington University in St. Louis and here at Type at Cooper. Jesse Ragan runs the Type Foundry XYZ Type with Ben Kiel. He designs custom typefaces and lettering independently in Brooklyn. He has served on the board of directors for AIGA New York and has taught here at Type at Cooper, a program that he helped co-found, and also at Pratt Institute. After graduating from RISD, Jesse started his career at Hoefler Frere-Jones, and his notable past designs include Gotham, Archer, and Omnes. So please welcome Ben and Jesse.
Hello, thank you for coming out.
It's good to see new faces and old faces. Thank you for coming out. I'm repeating. This is going to be bad.
I'm Jesse, and he's Ben, in case there was any question about that.
This is Jesse. I'm Ben. Our comedy routine is terrible, but here we go. Tonight we're going to talk about something new and something old. Just a little bit. We're going to do. Oh, it does the thing. Okay, cool. XYZ Type is our type foundry. See, Sasha kind of already did all this. Jesse's in Brooklyn. I'm in St. Louis. We wore stupid t-shirts, sweatshirts once, just for fun. Then we never used this photo except for lectures, so it was kind of worth it. So I'm going to talk about something new. Jesse's going to talk about something old.
But they're both kind of old and new.
They're both kind of old and new.
Yeah.
Are you going to
get off the stage?
Yeah, you're going to. Okay, good.
See you in a bit.
Jesse threatened just to stand behind me as I talk, which would have been weird. I'm going first because my slides unfortunately fall into the category of type design lecture of lots of just letters. Jesse he has a lot more interesting images. So if mine drags, don't worry, all the historical images are coming. So I'm going to talk about a design of mine which is now called grep, which is something new, or is it? So this is really the tale of a cheerfully boring typeface. Which is how we describe it. And it starts back in May of 2011. I got an email from the type designer Chris Soursby, who runs Klim Type in New Zealand, and he got an inquiry from PayPal to redo a branding typeface for them. And as a request, it was a pretty nice brief. They had a really tight brief, which if you deal with clients, sometimes people say, I just need something, and you're like, oh, great. Something is the worst. When you have it's true. Having a tight brief is nice. So they wanted a humanist sans that was mobile first and numeral centric because it's PayPal. What you deal with is money. Money was the thing. Numbers were the thing that were important. Obviously, this is my shout out to Lubalin. This is a project of mine that House Industries released called Worth Numerals. Nothing I'm going to show does justice to Lubalin, and right now they're running the 100 days of Herb Lubalin, so I just threw in these fun numbers. This is not what PayPal was looking for. They were looking for something like this. And so Chris and I together sort of figured out, the thing about PayPal and their apps and their website is the numerals have to carry all the weight. The numerals are where the interface shines. And so our pitch to them were this set of sort of interesting numerals that are 3/4 height, so they weren't quite old style, they weren't quite lining, they were slightly different than what everyone else were using. Of course, tabular, so everything lines up. And they said, great. We need 3 options so we can test those options in our eye tracking lab. And I don't know if that happened. And those 3 options need to have A through Z and all the numerals and currency. So this was the initial sketch. And if you work with a type designer as a project, normally initial sketches are just like test words to figure out what the design direction should be. So Chris and I were like, okay, we can do that. And of course, in anything, that initial deadline was pretty tight. So what do? As a type designer, you end up going grave digging. And I went back to August of 2005. So this is the part of the lecture where I show really embarrassing stuff. Here we go. So this is my work file from my the typeface I designed for the for my MA at the University of Reading, and its name was called I don't know, Cimarron. And so you get these work files that are about this big. This was the design brief that I wrote myself. I clearly cannot write design briefs. If you read this whole thing, which you might not want to, it originally was typeface design for large print, and then I realized somewhere in the process that actually testing to see if it would be good for large print wasn't going to be possible, or I didn't feel like doing it. Who knows? It was a while ago. So then it becomes a typeface that's, it's for university press typesetting. It's the loosest brief ever. And of course, this typeface, as you see, has all sorts of things. It's got weight issues. It's got really dumb serif structure. I never figured out how to finish the bottom of the T. The descender of the Y is incredibly short next to the P. I don't know why. What's this? Oh, yeah, I know I kerned this typeface. I know I kerned it, but it was bad. Yeah, the S is super awkward, and I can go on and on for a while, and I won't. Another page. This is just dumb. That didn't make it into the final one. At least I was smart enough to edit that out. So, yeah, just really dumb. Oh, did I? Sorry, I blew that one. Okay, so what was I looking at? My reference material for this project was kind of this weird combination. I was in England, Eric Gill, so I always sort of appreciated Gill's Joanna and Perpetua. So I was looking at Perpetua, and I was also looking at especially the line of type legibility group, and especially Excelsior at this time. And one of our teachers is Herod Unger, and you cannot get away from Swift at the University of Reading because it is the branding typeface for it's on every single sign. So this is Herod and his drawing for italics. Okay, that's Herod's drawings. These are my drawings. Herod is much better than I am. This is terrible. This is an early sketch, but it's pretty terrible. So anyway, the project kind of looked like this. Taking bits of Swift for the Swift and Excelsior and looking at those and coming up with my own design for the lowercase, while also looking at the designs, Gill's uppercase designs, so Perpetua as an example. So here's where I embarrass myself some more. There's this thing, you see Swift everywhere, and if you're working in an intense environment and you see one sort of thing all the time, you think this stuff creeps in. And so we spent forever trying to get Swift out of our type designs, and I clearly was not super successful at this. So Swift has this really nice feature where it has a really high arch. So so it's kind of not the same. The open counter on the A, that's not too bad. Swift has this really nice feature where the E looks slightly tilted because of the angle of the crossbar. I just angled the crossbar. So yeah. All right. But looking at these faces and what is interesting about these designs is that they're really open. They're made for really poor printing conditions, newspaper printing, and at smaller sizes. And looking at those sorts of designs for things that are supposed to be easy to read is a really nice starting point. So, the openings of the E's are very open. The openings of the E's are very open. That's a terrible sentence. The E's are very open. The A's are open. There's a lot of space, and these things help with legibility. So this project sort of ended up like this. And there you go. So we learned a lot together, and we're kind of dead at this point. All right, but back to this PayPal thing. So this project happens, and you got to find something. So what happens? Designers are very conscious of the environment. So type designers are always looking to reduce, reuse, and recycle. So you have a serif design. Well, you can start lopping stuff off. And pretty soon, you got a sans. So that's handy. So here's what Cimarron looked like. And this was the first version of the sans for it. So you see the spacing's really bad, but there's some bones here. It gets a little bit better, gets a little bit better still, and here's kind of the thing that became interesting about this project. And I'll go back. This is the second step, not the third step. And just to go between these two, the arches and the M and the way the top of the A is in this version, pretty much straight from the serif version, a little less contrast. In this version, those arches got a little bit more curved and the weight got thrown around in an interesting way. So we go from this to that to that. So this weight distribution is kind of stealing from something else. It's really coming from Antique Olive. And if you look at that A and this A, obviously the top of that A, totally stealing that idea of having the weight swell and then go into the stroke. So we come to this point, and it's come pretty far. And as we're designing this thing, we have a demo of what the interface is going to look like, and we made a little extension for RoboFont, and as we're designing, it's updating this, so we're seeing what the typeface is going to look like on screen. Because the point of this project was to design first for an unhinted screen environment, which if you use an Apple Mac, OS X doesn't apply any of the font hinting for the most part to the typeface. So we are looking at it on screen there and trying to design something sort of nice. And what we're looking at is coming up, so the serif is on one side, the sans on the other side. We're looking at making all ending strokes either vertical or horizontal so the screen rendering is better, and really opening up as much spaces as possible. So you see that in the C and the S. You'll see that weird serif T. It's like angled. I don't know why. Angled in like 4 different ways. So that got straightened out. And letters that are easily confused, like an uppercase I in a sans serif and a lowercase L, we added a tail to the L so you could distinguish the two. So we're doing those things. We enhanced some geometry. That's a joke. That's my dumb joke. And we changed the proportions. So if you look at this, the other thing that was important for this project was the typeface had to work really well on mobile and portrait. So if you think about your mobile phone, if you're an old man like me and prefer the iPhone S because those big phones are terrible, there's not a lot of screen real estate in the horizontal direction in portrait mode. So this thing got way more condensed, and the X height actually increased. So condensed, more X height. So at the end of the project, for PayPal, it looked like this. And this was part of the presentation. There were 2 other pages. And as part of the pitch, that one got axed. Just totally fine. Actually, it was kind of the best possible result because I ended up with something that's way better than this serif thing I started with. This design really found what it was meant to be. It wasn't meant to be a serif typeface. It works much better as a sans serif. So there we go. But the problem is, as a type designer, that was a very short project. It was a pitch. They went in one direction. Chris and I finished out that direction. It's weird to use PayPal now because I know the typeface very well that PayPal is using, so it's like PayPal speaking to me in the voice of an old friend, and I don't really consider PayPal necessarily an old friend, but there you go. So as a type designer, you're going to rethink everything as soon as you finish something, especially if you do a custom project. Custom projects are great as a type designer. I really like them. You get in, you have a fixed deadline, you stop overthinking decisions, and you make the thing to the brief, and then you're done. And then you open it up the next week, and you hate everything in it. That's not the part I like. The part I like is sort of being forced to turn off overthinking, because I think that's sort of a occupational hazard for type designers. So the overthinking starts happening. And start looking at other references for sort of things like this. So looking at probably the best 2 humanist sans, Frutiger and Lucida. And Lucida, or Lucida, I don't know how you're supposed to say that. Either one works. was the interface font for OS X for a very long time. So I've been using a Mac forever, so it's very familiar to me. And Frutiger is sort of everywhere. So you see these things. I'm just going to compare Frutiger and Cimarron a little bit. So you're looking at these things as you're making refinements. The refined version is what we're looking at. So the differences here, because there's no point in making a new typeface that's been already done. So what's different about this thing than, say, Frutiger? Well, the joins change. And that sort of structure comes from the original serif design. Things get a little softer and a little friendlier. We're kind of keeping the same structure for the E. We've added the tail for the L. And we've changed the X height. This has slightly a bigger X height and it's a little bit narrower than Frutiger. So if we look at Lucida, it's actually more open than Cimarron is. The S is more open. It doesn't quite have the same amount of contrast in some areas. The E's, it's a sans serif humanist E. You're not going to do much more. In some areas it has more contrast, in some areas it has less contrast. And it does open up a little bit more, but changing that structure to get that arch, to give it a little bit of warmth was important to this design. You'll see that. The other thing I looked at when rethinking this thing is really, this you don't read, but if you look just at the texture, at the text on the left, that's the version for PayPal, and the texture on the right is the current version. And the idea of making something really narrow for a mobile phone made a lot of sense, but it doesn't read quite as well in running text as you'd want. So actually, going through a bunch of testing, finding the right width for this was important. So the current version's on the bottom, the older version's on top, so you'll see how just widening it up makes it easier to read. So I've been using the word Cimarron, but the first slide you saw was grep. Font naming is terrible. It's really the worst part about typeface design. The drawing part is easy. Picking a name is the hardest thing. Jesse more than me actually, has list upon list and list of font names. And Jesse really actually did not like the name Cimarron. He can't argue, he's on the other side. He really actually hated it, I'll tell the truth. For various reasons. It's hard to spell, it's hard to remember. It's like cinnamon. I don't know. But he wore me down and actually convinced me that it wasn't the best thing. So then it was going to be decimal, and decimal I was really excited by. But there's a typeface name that's very close to decimal, so that goes there. So then being super nerdy, it becomes grep. So grep is a regex sort of thing in Unix. So it made sense because this is a typeface design meant for the screen, meant for user interfaces. And so it's a work in progress right now. It's been used a couple places. Our site, the site for a podcast called Working File. But that's sort of where it stands now. So that's sort of the process of grep. Now I'm going to pass Jesse.
So I'm going to talk about something very different, but with some parallels, as we'll hopefully see. This is a project I started quite a long time ago, and it's sort of a tribute to this typeface designer, Rudolf Ruzicka, who lived from 1883 to 1978. He was born in Bohemia. I'm going to try to pronounce the Czech, but I'm going to say it wrong. In Gorzim, Bohemia. He was born with the name Rudolf Ruzicka, I think. If anyone's Czech in the audience and wants to correct me, please see me afterward. Anyway, this is a view of his hometown, Gorzim, in Bohemia, on an engraving that Ruzicka did later in life. So he changed his name when he immigrated to the United States in 1894 with his family through Ellis Island to Rudolf Ruzicka, the Americanized form. He was an engraver, an illustrator, a book designer, a typographer, a typeface designer, and he did a lot of other things. He grew up in Chicago with his family, and in 1903, when he was 20 years old, moved to New York City. He never had like a proper full college education, but would take art classes in his spare time, and just was very interested in the arts, was a very literate person, and I think picked up English very quickly, became very well read and very interested in the arts. When he moved to New York, he was working for the American Banknote Company. He was doing engravings for them. He'd done a little bit of engraving when he was I think, 15 years old, when he was living in Chicago as an apprentice. So in New York, he had started a more active engraving career, and he, shortly after moving here to New York, met Frederick Goudy, who sort of took him under his wing and helped him get started with some of his work. I believe helped him set up a printing press in his studio so that he could print his etchings, his engravings and etchings. Ruzicka didn't like Goudy very much, I don't think. I've read a little bit about their dynamic, but he definitely helped him get his start there. This is just a shot of Ruzicka's actual engraving tools, which are at the Rauner Library at Dartmouth College. And these are a couple of his early, very professional quality engravings that he did. This is not long after he moved to New York. He put together a portfolio of samples and was sending them around to different people. Those caught the eye of Daniel Berkeley Updike, who was a book designer and printer in Massachusetts. This is the part of the talk where I'm going to show a lot of photos of old white men looking at tables, just looking at their desks. There's a lot of them. It's surprising. So he met Updike in 1907. He worked on a few projects with him. I think his first project was working on engraving a design by W.H. Wiggins for a frontispiece in a book that the Marymount Press was printing. Marymount Press was Updike's printing establishment. And this on the left is a greeting card, a New Year's card that he did later on. This is 1917 for Marymount Press, and then much later in 1930. They had a long relationship, Ruzicka and Updike. They were close friends. In 1930, he did this frontispiece for Fables of La Fontaine for the limited editions club. So through Updike, Ruzicka also met William Addison Dwiggins, who most of you probably know. Here he is, staring at his desk. They became good friends as well, mostly through correspondence. They would write letters to each other and would critique each other's work. They would send each other things for feedback and ask for tips about different aspects of their work. But Dwiggins then, in turn, introduced Ruzicka to another old white man looking at his desk, which was Chauncey Griffith. And he was the type director at Linotype, Mergenthaler Linotype in New York City, who Dwiggins had worked with on developing his own typefaces for the Linotype typecasting system. And here, working with Griffith, Dwiggins would have sort of a back and forth in developing typefaces. The Linotype drawing office would help hone in Dwiggins' designs. Dwiggins also came from a book design background and illustration background and went into typeface design, as we'll see more of. But Dwiggins really encouraged Ruzicka to work with Griffith and try to break into typeface design, which Ruzicka had not done this far in his life, although he had had quite a successful career in engraving and illustrating. This is a letter from Dwiggins to Ruzicka encouraging him to be in contact with Griffith about the possibility of developing a typeface. Much later, after Ruzicka released his first typeface, Fairfield, in the announcement booklet for that, Dwiggins wrote, "What could be more reasonable than to engage a man of this experience and accomplishment upon a project of type designing?" He described him as grounded in the craft of incising graphic images in wood and metal, which he saw as sort of a good foundation for designing a typeface, looking at form and counterform that way, thinking about the finesse of a shape. These are two later engravings by Ruzicka of scenes of New York. Ruzicka also did quite a bit of lettering in his work. On the left here is a greeting card from his family, where I believe, these are both woodcuts, I believe. And on the right is a header for a calendar page from the Marchbanks calendar. So he had a lot of experience looking at lettering, understanding lettering. He was a typographer trained in choosing typefaces for books that he was designing. So he decided to take the plunge, and he wrote to C.H. Griffith and asked him whether Griffith would be willing to look at some of his typefaces. And so they did. And these are the initial drawings that Ruzicka prepared for Griffith. These are 4 different typeface concepts. There may have been more. This is what I'm aware of. And none of these actually saw the light of day during Ruzicka's lifetime, except that one at the bottom right. But you can remember that one on the top right as well, which we'll come back to in a little bit. These are not fully formed ideas. They're interesting, and they have a lot of nice moves. But Ruzicka had never designed a typeface. He didn't really understand the nitty-gritty of the process, so he did need some help in figuring that out. And here's a letter from Dwiggins to Griffith from 1937. He writes, "I was sure Rudolph would come through with the hot stuff if we could start him. His combination of Czech plus USA gives just the outside touch we want, combined with a strong sense of our USA usage." And he goes on to say that he likes that Ruzicka's work, rather than copying other foundries, has something that's a little bit more new that could help Linotype as a type foundry lead the way in the industry, because a lot of their work up to that point, with the exception of most of Dwiggins' work, was really somewhat imitative and was trying to create for the Linotype typecasting system typefaces which would fill the needs of a printer and a designer. But Dwiggins was really adamant that they should be doing something new and leading the way in a new aesthetic. So that's where Ruzicka's particularly unique style and approach to typeface design became a great asset to Linotype. As Dwiggins and Ruzicka were close friends, they had a lot of correspondence about how to go about this process and what Dwiggins' experiences had been working with Griffith and working with the drawing office at Linotype. Dwiggins wrote a letter to Ruzicka, or actually a series of letters explaining the process of designing a typeface and how that work would go about. This was later published, so this is from the edition that was published by Harvard College Library. But he described a process which I'll show you demonstrating through Ruzicka's own images here rather than Dwiggins. So these are some of the final quality drawings that Ruzicka would send to Linotype, that the drawing office at Linotype would then use as the basis for their mechanical drawings, which would be used to make the type. So these are drawings for the typeface that was ultimately called Fairfield, for a few sample characters there. And I think these are not the final refined versions. You can see there's some notes on there that Roman K is maybe a little lopsided, could use a little more finesse. But then the drawing office at Linotype would then go on to take these drawings and really refine them into something that would work with their engraving system and then their casting equipment. I should say, by the way, that all of this, all of these sites that I'm showing are resources that are available in different institutions. These are from the Smithsonian Institution, which Paul Shaw shared these images with me. They have these original drawings. These amazing mechanical drawings for Linotype are at the Museum of Printing in Massachusetts. So here's a drawing of that same lowercase g, which you saw in the original drawing there, and then in mechanical form with notations about the thicknesses of strokes and those kinds of details, all of this drawn with special curve rulers and things, I'm sure. Making special dispensations for the way that the router would work in the engraving the matrices for Linotype, as well as the characteristics of a specific size of type when it was printed. So there were a lot of compensations made that were a little bit above Ruzicka's expertise that were specific to creating a Linotype typeface. They would also make special versions of a typeface. So in the case of Fairfield, there was a special version with shorter ascenders and descenders, or maybe just descenders, I'm not sure. There's the shorter G from that. They would go through a whole process of working back and forth and refining the typeface, much like typeface designers do now. Draw the letters, then print things out and look at them. So Linotype would, in some way, generate these proofs that they could send back to Ruzicka to review how the letters are working together. Here's another one for his later typeface primer. And through that, they would have it back and forth. Ruzicka would send refined drawings back to Linotype. They would make adjustments. They would send him a new proof. And this was how Linotype was able to refine his designs, and also how Ruzicka gained more of an education in the process of typeface design as well. So this is Linotype Fairfield as it was ultimately released in 1939. This was Ruzicka's first typeface released. He was already in his 50s by that point, so it was a little bit later in life for him, but he had a long career ahead of him, as you'll see still. A few years after that, in 1947, because Fairfield had been a success, Linotype also developed a new version of it called Fairfield Medium, which was just slightly heavier for some settings. They never made a bold version, but these two close weights for text were palatable to printers at the time. Then in 1951, Linotype released his typeface primer, which you can see here. Just for a little fun, here are some ads for Fairfield and primer. I thought were kind of fun from the 50s, I believe. And I just thought, throw this in for good measure, one more old white man staring at a desk. Ruzicka had reached a level of notoriety by this time that he was appearing in newspaper ads for Strathmore Paper or magazine ads as a celebrity spokesperson. So at this point in time, there are a number of Ruzicka typefaces available in digital form. There's the official Linotype version of Fairfield, and there is the bitstream version of Fairfield, which is known as Transitional 551. A lot of the bitstream faces had secret names when they were first released. And then there is a newer digitization called Fanwood, which is a free font, a Libra font. From Primer, there's only the bitstream version called Century 751. And then there are a couple oddities. There's this one called Lake Informal, which is said to be based on a Ruzicka concept. I've never seen that concept, so I don't really know what the story is behind that. It seems unlike his work to me, so I'm curious about that one if I ever can find out more information. But there's also Ruzicka Freehand, which is actually the Ruzicka typeface I see used most frequently. I see it on like Edie's Ice Cream, I think. Like always food things. It's a very food-oriented typeface, seemingly. It's a decent typeface, actually, but I think there are some missed opportunities. Everything's a little bit soft in there, and Ruzicka had done this style of lettering several times for other projects. It had this great lowercase g, and it was very crisp. This is a bad photo, but sharp corners and very angular curves. Some of that got lost in the digital version. There are also these really exciting, bizarre tests for a bold weight, which are also in the Smithsonian collection, but none of that was ever produced in metal. It was only produced in this digital form, and there is no bold version for that. But I want to talk a little more about Ruzicka's approach to typeface design, and he wrote a bit about that in the announcement for Fairfield, which I quoted earlier from Dwiggins' comment. But I'm just going to read a little excerpt of this little booklet that was used to announce Fairfield. He wrote that the reader expects nothing but to be left in optical ease when he pursues his reading. He wants no interruptions of the process or following the printed thought. From this apparently simple attitude, a hasty deduction of raw theory of mere legibility could be made. The less character and individuality there is in a typeface, the easier it should be to read. Here, however, we come upon two interrelated problems, one physical and the other aesthetic. Problem of fatigue and the problem of monotony of appearance. For extensive reading, there must be furnished some degree of stimulation and pleasure to the eye to overcome fatigue and to give the eye its due satisfaction. Type should be designed to submerge consciousness and invite reading. So I think that's kind of encapsulates what I like about Ruzicka's work, that it is somewhat staid and it is regular and it's not very distracting, but it does have a lot of personality if you look more closely, and there are always some sort of clever moves hidden in there. He said that there should be a kind of impersonal ease about type. It is, after all, only a medium between writing and reading. But to invite continuous reading, type must have a subtle degree of interest and variety of design. And then he went on to write that some characteristics like the fitting of each character on its body and the way that different characters are designed to work together were the things that he was most concerned about because he knew the least about it. So I think he acknowledged that he needed Linotype's help for making these things work. This is in the 60s, Ruzicka moved to Hanover, New Hampshire to live closer to his daughter. He was getting on in years, and he lived right off the campus of Dartmouth College. This is the house he lived in Hanover, New Hampshire. I'm not a stalker, but I did go take a photo of his house where he lived in the late 60s. Here's Rudolf Ruzicka, an old white man staring at his desk, and here he is at Dartmouth College with his close friend Edward Connery Latham, who was a librarian and dean at Dartmouth. Here they're in a photo shoot for an exhibition of Ruzicka's work that was done at the college. But Latham actually brought Ruzicka on to create this beautiful portfolio of alphabets. This is in 1968 now. So he was in his 90s by then, right? So he had all these ideas for typefaces that he never finished. Some of those things that he'd submitted to Linotype, which he continued to develop over the year, things that he'd used for those greeting cards and other engravings that he did. He did a lot of book plates, which I'll show more in a bit, but he had all these ideas, and they had never really gotten out there. I think it was probably a little late for him to try to actually create the typefaces, so he just put it all together in a portfolio and created this beautiful book of alphabets, which actually I have in person here if you want to come up and look afterward. Feel free to thumb through. And there are a few other Ruzicka artifacts here. But this is just a loose portfolio of these broadside alphabets that show concepts for typefaces. And again, going back to that idea of how he depended on Linotype for the creation of the typefaces, he wrote in the introduction to the portfolio, "For one concerned with legibility, there should be the task of relating stem, hairline, counter, and serif to each other and to the weight of the larger mass. It is a far cry from design to typeface, but it is a pleasure to watch and hopefully march in the parade." A little flowery, but he's, I think, acknowledging that these are not finished products. These are not typefaces that could be used immediately, but that they are concepts that then would have to be developed further. To me, that was sort of sounded a little bit like an invitation that he would like for these to become typefaces. He would like to see these translated into something that could be actually used. In his introduction and in other things that he's written, he made it clear that he was somewhat approaching these with concern about the limitations of a linotype, which now are quite irrelevant in a lot of ways for digital type design. But there were 10 different plates that were published in the book. They're all up here if you want to take a look. A lot of varied different alphabets. There are a lot of sort of book serif faces and then some more fanciful things as well. I got really excited about this and saw that no one had done anything with any of these typefaces with the exception of the one that Ruzicka Freehand, that digital typeface, was based upon. So I got the idea in my head that maybe I could take this on because I'd always felt really drawn to his work. Felt drawn to the warmth of it, the, as I said, sort of subtle eccentricities, which I think relate to the work of Dwiggins. If you're familiar with the very quirky things that Dwiggins did, Ruzicka's are maybe a little bit more strained, but still I think have a lot of that same kind of wit behind them that I really appreciate. So I actually got in touch with Ruzicka's only living descendant and talked to him about this. He was very enthusiastic about the project happening, about these being made into digital typefaces. So I just dove in and started with this one, which is from the first plate of the portfolio, Studies in Type Design. And I started on it. I worked on it quite a bit. This was in 2009, and it was a while ago. And I picked it up every few years and messed with it a little bit, but I never quite figured out what I wanted to do with it, how to resolve a lot of the unresolved questions. But then, 9 years later, in 2017, Original Champions of Design came to me. Bobby Martin and Jennifer Kynan are here. They are the partners of OCD Agency, Original Champions of Design. They're a branding and design agency who I've worked with several times over the years on some very interesting projects. But they had been tasked with this exciting challenge of rebranding Dartmouth College itself. And since we had worked together, they brought me in and asked if I had any recommendations for what kind of typefaces they might use for this branding, or if I had anything in the works that might be relevant for that. And I said, well, yes, actually, let me pull out my laptop and show you this huge project I embarked upon that's basically exactly what you're looking for, I think. And it actually turned out to work quite well. So one of the alphabets in this book is this sort of slightly serifed design, which he also used in several other places. He designed a lot of medals later in his life, and this is one of them, which was the Dartmouth Bicentennial Medal, which he created in 1968, released in 1969. Here's the original drawing for that from Rhode Library at Dartmouth College. It was great to be able to see these things in person. And this is the plate from Studies in Type Design that includes that alphabet. Beautiful capitals, really stately and I think somewhat unique. There's a little relation to like Fris Quadrata. I see that connection, but I think his are a lot more elegant and have more of a calligraphic underpinning. Lowercase, I don't know, not that fond of. So creating that as a typeface may be a questionable thing. I'm not quite sure what I'll do about the lowercase. Anyway, we found that it could be quite a good fit for the logotype for Dartmouth. And looking at the different reference that I had, that plate from Studies in Typeface Design, or Studies in Type Design, as well as the drawings for that bicentennial medal, we tried a few different approaches to that. And here's 4 different R's that we tested out when we were looking at the logotype, possibly doing something that was just a sans serif, but carried out the personality of Ruzicka's work, much like what Ben was showing with Grep. We settled on the one on the far right, and this is the logotype we settled on. So it's very streamlined from what Ruzicka did. I think it feels more contemporary, but it still has just a very genuine connection to the history of the institution. It really is sort of in their DNA. So I think that's a great story to tell, but also it just feels academic. I think it feels right for the college. We also happened to really hone in on this one design which I had started, which is the one that I'd spent the most time on, based on the first plate. This is a quote from Robert Frost here. I had been calling the thing Frost, although there's another typeface now with that name, because naming is difficult. But this is that alphabet, the first plate of Studies in Type Design, which you can see in more detail here. As Dwiggins had commented, a lot of Ruzicka's work really has that Czech plus USA aesthetic. That's what Ruzicka said, or what Dwiggins said about him. There's some sort of angularity and calligraphic underpinning that really, I think, goes back to Ruzicka's Czech heritage. He also had spent a good bit of time returning to his hometown and visiting other parts of what was then the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia. So anyway, he created these alphabets that have a lot of that unique personality. So we decided to go full steam ahead with this and create this as a branding typeface that would go hand in hand with the logotype. The logotype is just for that one name for Dartmouth, spelled out in that style. And then this companion typeface is complementary and has a lot of Ruzicka's hallmarks in it, but has its own unique characteristics. So luckily, Dartmouth really bought into this idea, really liked the whole idea behind it, the history behind it. They even brought me up to Hanover, New Hampshire to go visit Dartmouth College and look through the archives there. I went to the Rhode Library, which holds most of Ruzicka's papers there. They have a great collection of like 12 boxes of stuff. I still have not looked through it all. I spent 3 days there in the fall of last year, and still haven't seen everything. But one of the most amazing things I was able to see, here's me staring at a desk, was the original artwork for these plates. So all of this, believe it or not, these incredibly detailed and incredibly finessed drawings for alphabets were painted by hand. I don't know how much you can see there, the brush strokes and the white that he used to cover his mistakes or things that he wanted to revise. But I was able to really look at these closely and see what the thinking behind them was. Also, really amazingly, they had 4 plates that were never published that did not make it into the book. So I think he edited it down from 10 to 14 at some point. I can see why some of these didn't make it in. They're not quite as refined, but there's a lot of interesting ideas in here. There are a lot of things that I'd like to return to as inspiration. So these are the 4 other plates. That definitely would not fly in Linotype, that connected script there. But, so to give you a sense of like what the difference it made to look at those original plates, those original paintings for the plates, this is a scan of that piece of paper right there, which is printed from the original drawings that were made in a photostat, I assume. But there are a lot of things that are ambiguous here. Like if you look at the left underneath the crossbar of the H, there's a little angle there. Like, was that intentional? Is that a mistake? Did his paint spill? What's going on? There are questions about, like, did he mean there to be a sharp corner on the inside of the bottom bowl of the G, or is that just an accident? You know, what were his intentions there? Why is there a weird purple dot inside the bowl of the G? And looking at the collection, I was able to find out the answer to a lot of those questions. So there's a purple dot because he made a little extra dot of paint on there, and nobody caught it and scraped it off of the film. The bottom of the H, that looks like a mistake to me. So I decided I'm not bringing in that little curve there as I started looking at things. As I refined this further, I had to make a lot of other compensations, looking at things in context, looking at the full alphabet together, looking at how the serif structure differed dramatically from one letter to another because he's just painting these by hand on the page. Figuring out how all those things could come together in a more cohesive system. So as he said, when you're reading, no one letter jumps out at you. There's a continuous ease of reading as you look at the typeface. Here's just a quick comparison of an auto-traced version of that printed paper and my digital font as it finished. Obviously, you can't see the details too much, but you can see in a general sense, I really stayed quite close to the original source material in the final typeface that I created. That said, the original document only had the Roman and some italic, a full Roman alphabet, and then some text in italic, so not even a full character set for that. So this is what I'd created way back when I was just looking at the printed document and hadn't really looked closely at the original paintings for it. And that's what I've created finally, from there to there. Made a lot of changes, figured out a lot of things about what the system he had created with the alignments of things and the weights of things, what should be sharp, what should be soft. And hopefully I've captured some of the softness of the original without sacrificing it for something that looks too digital. That's always my fear, is to make something that feels too much like a digital font and doesn't capture the warmth of what was intended. This is the original bold that I made 9 years ago. I have yet to find any really bold lettering by Rudolf Ruzicka, so I don't have a good reference for how he would handle adding weight to a stroke in any sense. A couple things that were like sans serif, which is a very different approach. So I was just shooting in the dark here. But this is a situation where, as I came back to this project much later and started working on it with OCD, they really were confident that they wanted to have an extra bold weight as well, something heavier than this. And I know that for one thing, it's easier to make something look bold when there's more difference between thick and thin. And also that if I took this and tried to make it bolder, it would just turn into mud. So I took this and I actually reworked everything into a higher contrast version of the bold, which I think is much sharper, has a lot better personality, and really carries the calligraphic underpinnings in a lot of ways. I learned a lot in 9 years, hopefully, too. This also made way for this extra bold, which I think is really a fun addition to the family. Not something I really would have tried to do if OCD hadn't pushed me to, so that was actually a fun challenge, and hopefully have created something that fits into the system well. It also created the opportunity for the extra bold italic, which is pretty fun, and definitely something that Ruzicka would not have drawn, but hopefully relates to what he would want. So throughout this, I'm having to make a lot of decisions like that are not really contained in this one piece of paper I have to work from. I don't have all the information I might need. So I had to look to other sources. I looked to other lettering by Ruzicka. These are book plates he designed over the years. This is yet another medal that he designed for Dartmouth College. This is the other was the bicentennial medal, which is a publicly distributed memento of their bicentennial. Actually, there is one up here. It's just a small little disc, but you're welcome to look at that as well as the papers. This is the Dartmouth Medal, which is actually a prestigious award, which I do not have a copy of, sadly. And also for reference, I could look back to what he did for linotype. So here are some drawings for the Fairfield punctuation and currency symbols. That's a really helpful reference for how would he approach these things. Not having seen these and just looking at the printed linotype specimens, I wouldn't be totally sure, did the linotype office just decide what to do for the section mark? But no, Ruzicka actually had a hand in what that section mark should look like. So I looked at a lot of these different resources and sort of brought it together and tried to create those extended characters in a way that I thought Ruzicka might have liked. Like that italic ampersand, there was no italic ampersand to go by, or no Roman ampersand, but I looked at his other typefaces. That italic ampersand came from another one of these plates, essentially. So that was an interesting process. Also, looking at the diacritics is a tricky thing. I wanted something that definitely looked good in Czech. That's really key because I wanted to be truthful to his heritage. I did find this one beautiful piece of calligraphy that he did for the embassy for the Czechoslovak Republic that has some diacritics on it, so I have some idea of how he would handle things there. That's what I came up with for the diacritics. I spent a little time in the Lubalin Center across the hall here and looked at some other Czech typefaces, which I'll show you some images, which really helped inform that. But at Dartmouth College and the Rauner Library, they had so many other amazing resources, like a sketchbook that Ruzicka kept where he was looking at different manuscripts, calligraphic sources, and just tracing or redrawing all of the full alphabet and the ampersand from all these different styles of calligraphy. So that was very interesting to see. Looking at what other resources he referred to, they have just folders of his swipe, his reference material that he used. There's a lot of Czech stuff in there. These are all works by Czech artists. He followed a lot of other engravers and also typeface designers. I do not know how to say this typeface designer's name, Karl with the D, but this is one of his typefaces, which is, I think, has a lot of relation to the work that Ruzicka did. Ulrich Menhardt, there were references in there in the archive as well, like his beautiful typeface Figaro, which I think bears a lot of connection to the work that Ruzicka did. All that tension between form and counterform, the soft on the outside, sort of crunchy on the inside. Another of his contemporaries, who was not Czech, was Raymond de Bol, and this is a sample from a book that Raymond de Bol published that's entirely written out in his calligraphy. So there were a lot of helpful hints there about how to handle things, what decisions to make. In the original plate in Studies in Type Design, the italic alphabet has these lovely swashes coming off of the ascenders of the L, H, F, D, and then also swash capitals for the A and the M. There's not a lot to go on because it's not a full alphabet. And to say the truth, I think that Ruzicka's work in swash capitals was not so great in the other work that I've looked through. It's always feels a little like he hadn't quite figured it out. So I included those swash capitals in this Dartmouth typeface. I also included as the default much more straightforward capitals because we found that obviously you're going to need something more straightforward, but we quickly found also that those swash ascenders, even with normal caps, feel quite too precious if you're setting something like a magazine article for a Dartmouth publication. So we went with, as the default, these much more straightforward italic or slanted Roman ascenders. So it still maintains a lot of the calligraphic underpinnings of Ruzicka's work, and those calligraphic swash capitals and ascenders are there as alternates if you want them. I did decide to keep some more calligraphic moves in the typeface as a default and as the only form for certain things, like in the italic, the capital Z, lowercase z, the J's, the capital Q has a little more of a lilt to it. The capital R has a tail that swashes out. So some of that calligraphic energy is there, but the things that would distract you more have been taken out. You can also see here that I'm trying to be sensitive to what happens when weight is added. We have the regular semi-bold and the extra bold here. In the extra bold, the tail of the Q changes a little bit and becomes just overlapped with the bowl. So it's important to look at those kinds of changes as you look at the system of the typeface to make sure that things work in every context rather than just trying to make one size fit all. I've been rereading, there's two books here which are Ruzicka's memoirs and then his letters with Daniel Berkeley Updike. And in rereading those, there was a funny little anecdote where he said that in drawing the S, he said, I could never figure out how to draw an S. And then I realized you could just take an 8 and cover up 2 parts of it, and it'll be an S, kind of like Ben's sans serif. But obviously, there's a lot more to it than that. But I read that just recently, and I thought, oh, man, I wish I'd read that before I drew these 8s, because the 8s maybe should look more like the S's. So this is drawn before I thought about that. So it's interesting to get those little tidbits that can get me in his head. And then this is intended both as a display face and a text face, which is always a challenging thing. I think it works for both, hopefully. It can be used for paragraphs of reading text. I wouldn't use the extra bold at small sizes, but it's there for more flashy situations or display situations. So this is the family as it ended up. There's ranging from an extra light, which is lighter than what Ruzicka drew, to the extra bold, which is much bolder than what he drew. You can see a little more in headlines here. So throughout this process, I had a lot of back and forth with Bobby and his team at OCD, and they gave me feedback that really helped shape the direction of it. It's funny how one little comment that Bobby would give me, like, I go spinning on that, and it would change the course of a little part of it. And I think with both of these projects, what Ben's talking and I am as well, having something to focus on there really helps steer the project. Whenever I have a question point, it's like, well, what would Dartmouth want to do with this? Does this serve this purpose? Do they even need swash capitals? Yeah, maybe in the graduation bulletin they'll want something more flowery. So those really helped me make the decisions. But here you can see this great animation that OCD made to announce the project when they brought everything together. They have a whole system using this lone pine tree, which is sort of a historical insignia of Dartmouth College, and the custom typeface. There's a symbol called the D pine, which incorporates the D from the logotype and then that lone pine tree. Because OCD is obsessive compulsive, really determined to get to those details, they made a really sharp and complete guide to using the branding system for Dartmouth to use. And this shows how the typefaces are to be used. It's paired with Chris Sowerby's National Number 2, to give a little shout out to Chris again. And these two really dovetail nicely. They both have sort of an organic feeling and then a lot of structure underneath. For the range of usage that Dartmouth wants for these typefaces, they really need more than one thing. They need a sans and a serif to really have a broad range of expression and be able to make different pieces of collateral work differently. So I really appreciate the detail that they put into this kind of product so that the typeface will be used well. They also showed off all of the features in the typeface, the small caps, tabular figures, lining and old style figures, the fractions, etc. And here you can see how this plays out in the system. The logotype can lock up with the different names of departments. They have a system ready to go where they can just type out what they need. It's already been implemented on the stationery. This is the business card. There's a great little system for the backs of the business cards with different elements from the branding system. They used it in this little booklet that introduces the refresh, the branding, which you can see here. These have also gone up on these banners for the different houses at Dartmouth. Is that what this is? I think. Yeah. Yes. I haven't seen them in person yet, but Bobby just sent me these. So, little tiny around the corner, you can see around the curve, you can see Dartmouth Ruzicka there. Also, this all coincides with the upcoming 250th anniversary of Dartmouth University next year, so I think they're really gearing up to have a new look for that time. For me, it's a very exciting time because it's 50 years from the publication of Studies in Type Design in 1968. And in celebration of that 50th anniversary, I do very much hope to release this typeface through XYZ or Foundry within the next few months. I think it's a great time to celebrate this beautiful collection of typefaces that Ruzicka created, or concepts. And my arrangement with Dartmouth allows me to go on and sell this in a slightly different form. It will have some different characteristics. It'll be in a different name, which I still have not decided on because naming is difficult. Anyway, I have to say, like, this project, probably I would not have jump-started it so much, definitely would not have put the time in that I was able to with Dartmouth underwriting at this point, with OCD having the foresight to come to me, and Dartmouth wanting to really invest in this aspect of their heritage. So I'm just really grateful that they were able to seize that opportunity. And this is just a little aside that in the back of in the title page, title page of Studies in Type Design, there's a copyright line. And this is a document from the Rauner archive at Dartmouth College, where Ruzicka apparently had redrawn the last numeral in the copyright date from 1967 to 1968. The note on here says, "John, this seems the best solution. I only hope I shall not have to change it in 1969. And so I hope that I'll have this typeface in 2018, not 2019. And with that, I'll bring back Ben.
So,
Those are our fonts.
those are our fonts.
Yeah, I guess, we wanted to talk about these projects, but we also really saw that there was a lot of connection between the two things and how they helped us get to something that we could release for our Type Foundry. At the end of the day, we love doing custom work, and we also want to run a retail font store, XYZ Type. So this kind of work, working with clients, I think is really one of the best ways to kick off a new typeface concept, a way to create something that actually has a practical application, that fills a need, that serves a purpose.
And what's interesting about both projects, we're digging in history. One is personal history, and one is history. But the end result is examining the past, whether it's something that you did or someone else did, and then your reinterpretation of that, and then your reinterpretation of that, leads to, these projects wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had a client asking for them. And so that really kickstarts the process again, and to look back and say, oh, there was this thing I did, and maybe I'm not the proudest of it, maybe it's not the best thing, but it's an interesting thing in finding what the best parts of it are that you can take forward to make an interesting project for a client or for a retail release. Yeah.
Fun slide?
Yes.
And there's the two of us looking at a desk. Thank you.
So thank you.
So please, we're happy to answer questions, and please stick around afterward if you want to come up and take a look at these. But yeah. Colin?
Both of these two typefaces, they seem they're very personal projects for both of you. I was wondering if there was anything that, if anything that each other had influenced in the design or the reworking of things to bring them to your own to release together.
You mean in that we're working together, how that influences the
Was
designs? Yeah.
there anything that an idea that Ben posed for your Dartmouth typeface or that Jesse posed for Rep that sort of took things in a different direction or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can say, go ahead.
Yeah, we pass stuff back, and so because we work in different offices and we have sort of, we tend to work in isolation, and then we send proofs back and forth, and so we're giving feedback to each other, not all the time, but often, and a lot of things, working, you lose sight of what's good. And so for me, Jesse really pushed grep to be a lot wider than it is. The difference is not huge. It's minuscule, but it's not. And it's something that I sort of resisted. But through his feedback, it really kind of helped me see, no, actually, unfortunately, Jesse was right. I was wrong.
Well, and that came in through a sort of client relationship as well, because
Yeah.
we were our own client designing the website for XYZ Type. We wanted
Yeah.
to use grep for the text of that, and I said, Ben, this is too narrow. It's too
And it
narrow.
was too
It's
narrow.
hard to read.
Yeah.
And maybe it's great for the PayPal app on your phone, but for the text on our website, it doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
So it gave us an opportunity to focus the approach to designing grep to just make that small change. It's very small change, but it has a ripple effect that really affects things. So. More questions? I can only see the front row. So Eric?
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about how your practice has changed going from being independent type designers to running a foundry? Or if it has?
Well, I mean, Ben likes to say we got tired of hiring each other for projects
Yeah.
when we were working independently. This typeface that's on the screen, Cortado, I had gotten a commission for, and I knew that Ben had a lot of expertise that I didn't from working at House Industries, and got him to help work on that. So that was kind of part of the testing ground for our project. Before
Yeah.
that, Ben had hired me.
Yeah, when I was at House, we hired Jesse for a bunch of projects, so I was his art director for a bunch of things. So we've hired each other a lot. So we kind of know what we're going to get when it comes to feedback. We don't have to pay each
lot
other
of
anymore.
nitpicking.
Yeah, a lot of nitpicking. We don't have to pay each other anymore, so I don't know if that was the best business decision.
We can lose money together.
Yeah,
instead.
we lose money together instead of separately. So that's been a change. I think the biggest thing to our practices is it's shown the value of collaboration, and we collaborate on. We tend to draw things separately because Jesse and I kind of have two compatible but different approaches to typeface design, but running a foundry means that we have to make a bunch of joint decisions, and so that collaboration, whether it is marketing or strategy or accounting, as dumb as that sounds, like that collaboration and being able to bounce something off. Like in my private practice, I don't have anyone to ask some questions to, and having a partner that I can ask questions and pose, be like, I don't understand this. Can you help me? Like, writing quotes, yeah, bouncing
half
stuff.
of our time.
Yeah, bouncing stuff back and forth is something we didn't have before as solo practitioners, and that's been tremendously helpful both in my private practice and obviously as our foundry.
I think also like Ben has much better historical knowledge than I do, so I feel like you're able to help
In
me
some
figure things out.
Yeah.
Type history things. So, yeah, I think we each have our strengths, and that brings us together. Other questions? Anyone? Yeah.
What do you know about how you go finding a typeface to revive? Is it like deliberate when you go looking for a designer or a space, or is it more organic, you just come across it?
I mean, it depends on, we have those like pet projects that like, I've always wanted to do something with that. Or a client comes to us and says,
Yeah.
we need something that does this, or, like your Schlafly thing. Or,
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, like for you, Razika was like, Jesse didn't say this, but finding that portfolio of typeface designs when you were an undergraduate, right,
Yeah.
was something that was hugely influential to your career. And so you have like this very strong personal connection to it. And I have some things like that that I don't know if I'll ever make or make for a client. I just might make for myself. But I tend not to do a lot of revivals. It's more interesting to draw newer things. But when I've done lettering for local St. Louis-based beer distributors, and sort of digging into type history because Schlafly happens to be located in a lithography plant, an old lithography plant, and like digging through St. Louis type history to find stuff for them. That's kind of fun, but those tend to be more lettering projects than typefaces.
yeah, I think it, I was talking earlier with Ben about like what's the idea of like authenticity in typeface design, and what does that mean? I don't know. I mean, I'm not a type design theorist that much, but it's something that I come back to a lot of, like how authentic is this revival of the Razika thing, and what's the value of that, and the authenticity of that history. But also, I think when Matthew Carter spoke on the stage, he said something that I always liked, which was my attitude toward history is entirely predatory. And I think that you have to have a little bit of both, like the authenticity and the just reach and grab what you want, and find something that you can put together into something new. Because everything you create, even if it's a really faithful revival, you're making decisions and you're making something new. So that was a long-winded answer. But I saw another.
Yeah, there's a question
hand.
from the second row.
Was there any particular reference in naming graph typeface as Cimarron in the beginning?
Cimarron came from Cimarron, New Mexico. That's where I got the name. Basically, the mountains of New Mexico.
Venezuela is when the slave runs away to break free.
Oh, really?
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
that is ironic.
Because it's something related to money.
Yeah. Huh, that's funny.
Maybe not the best font name
Yeah.
then, too. Another point for me.
You're going to prove Jesse right.
What does grep mean in Spanish? Anyone else? Feel free to come up to us after, too, if you have a question and didn't want to shout it out. Yeah.
It's really hard to see.
How do you balance the client's like, suggestions and interests when you're designing something for them versus like your own sensibilities on things? Do you just let it go, or do you, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Jesse, how do you
Yeah. Oh, clients are the worst, especially OCD. Yeah.
do you give them? When you know that like something's just like sound or correct, but they want something.
I think that one thing that I love about being a typeface designer is that my clients are almost always graphic designers, people who understand type, who are a little type nerdy and are really excited to work with the type designer. And they're really excited to learn in the process. So usually there's a bit of teaching in that process, and most of the time if I come back and say, you know, like the crossbar of the H should be lighter than the stems of the H because of optical correction, they'll be like, oh, I see now, you know, like they're excited about that kind of education. So a lot of times that's actually works to the advantage, but then a lot of times they're like, no, I understand, but actually I want that crossbar to be as heavy as the stems. So yeah, I mean, at some point you just do what they say. Right, Bobby? No. No, these guys are great. But yeah, I mean, and then it's also like, I do a lot of like logo lettering work, and for that, in a way, the investment is very different than in a typeface. In a typeface, you're going to have those letters repeated over and over, and it's a much more complex system, and that's a little harder to put something broken in such a complex machine. You can put something broken into a 4-letter logotype, and it still works. You know, the logotype's not broken. There might just be one little thing that's wonky, and maybe that's good. So.
I think it's also, you kind of know what for the most part, you know what the project brief is. If the project brief doesn't make sense, you might just not take the project. And so you know in the process, obviously, you're going to have aesthetic differences sometimes with the client, but if the project brief from the get-go is kind of flawed, then you take pause.
And say, how much will you pay me?
Yeah.
To sell my soul.
And you won't put my name attached to this, right?
Any last questions? I see one in the back. Yeah.
Is there anything, like, are there any qualities about each of the faces that you've produced through XYZ that they all sort of have in common? Or are there, or is there any, are there any, like, distinct qualities, you know, that you guys sort of look for, you know, as a foundry, sort of working together, to sort of set yourself apart from other foundries? You know, this new identity that you guys form and work together.
There's one key quality they had in common when we launched the Foundry is that they were done when it was time to launch the Foundry. So that's what we released. I think we had all kinds of strategies about like, what is the voice of our Foundry? Oh, this Ruzika stuff, it's like so different from Export, Cortado, and Aglet
Yeah.
Slab, which are the ones we have out. Like, maybe that doesn't fit here. Maybe I should go like, sell this somewhere else. And we're like, you know what? When it's done, just sell it. Yeah. So I think that everything has some underlying personality that has some connective tissue, because my stuff is from my brain, Ben's stuff is from his. The stuff we do together has some of both of us. And I think we just have sort of a compatible sensibility. But it comes back to, yeah, I mean, what qualities would you say?
I will say this, that we are very lucky right now in that we don't have, well, I don't know. We're lucky in terms of establishing a voice because we don't have a large range of things. And so the voice right now of our Foundry is indeterminate to a certain degree. And as time goes on and as we release more things, I think there are two ways of doing it. You can have a plan at the beginning and know exactly this is going to be the tone. And then the other way of doing is looking back in hindsight and being like, oh, this is what makes an XYZ typeface.
And now we're going to boot the first 3 things we released it because,
Well,
which a lot of foundries do.
Yeah, that's actually kind of true. But I think as that grows, then our selection process changes. But right now, our selection process is partly like opportunistic. Like, is it done? Great, we're releasing it. Is it done and we think it's good? I guess we should say it's not done. It's done
Well,
and we like it.
it's not done till it's good.
Yeah.
But it's finished before it's perfect.
Yeah. We have lots of slogans on Slack. So we have that opportunity to develop our voice based on the things that get released. So ask us that question in 5 years, and we'll have a very concise answer. But right now, it's like shruggy emoji.
I think that's a good note to end on. So thanks for coming, you guys.
Thank you very much.